In 1870, a 31-year-old man in Cleveland, Ohio, controlled roughly 4% of America's oil refining capacity. 10 years later, he controlled around 90%. And by the early 1900s, he wasn't just dominating refining, he had influence across production, distribution, and sales so dense it felt less like a company and more like a nervous system. His name was John D. Rockefeller, and the uncomfortable truth is this: the system he designed did not die when Standard Oil was broken apart in 1911. It didn't even weaken. It learned, it adapted, it spread. Because what Rockefeller built wasn't merely an oil empire. He built a method, an operating system for modern corporate control. And in 2025, you live inside it. Every time you pump gas, click Buy Now, fill a prescription, open a search engine, swipe into a bank app, or eat food produced by a supply chain so consolidated you can't even see its edges, you're touching a world shaped by a playbook that was perfected more than 150 years ago. Not the brand, Standard Oil, the method. Vertical integration, horizontal consolidation, regulatory capture, reputation laundering through philanthropy, legal architecture that turns power into something that looks like paperwork. And the genius of it, the part that makes it so hard to escape, is that it's not illegal by default. It's not even hidden. It's simply normalized, embedded into corporate law, tax codes, and market structure until it feels like gravity, everywhere, constant, unquestioned. Here is the Rockefeller blueprint, simplified into a few steps. Control the supply chain from top to bottom. Eliminate competitors side to side. Shape the rules meant to restrain you. Use generosity to buy legitimacy. And if government finally forces a breakup, make sure the pieces you keep are worth more than the whole. That's not just history, that's a repeating pattern. And once you learn to recognize it, you start seeing the same geometry everywhere. Different logos, different industries, the same underlying design. But to understand the system, you have to meet the man, not the myth, not the cartoon villain, the strategist. John Davidson Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in Richford, New York, into a household that was, in a strange way, a rehearsal for the world he would later build. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was widely described as a traveling salesman and swindler, known for schemes, deception, and selling questionable cures. His mother, Eliza, was a devout Baptist, disciplined, strict, moral to the bone. And that combination, ruthlessness paired with moral certainty, became Rockefeller's most dangerous asset. Because Rockefeller didn't see himself as a predator, he saw himself as an organizer, a man chosen, almost appointed to bring order to chaos, efficiency to waste, structure to industries that looked like gambling dens disguised as marketplaces. This is the psychology of many modern monopolists. They don't believe they're stealing. They believe they're correcting the world. Then, in 1859, oil was discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and what followed wasn't a calm industrial expansion, it was a fever. Men rushed in with drills and dreams, money flooded the region, prices whiplashed, overproduction collapsed markets, then shortages spiked them. Fortunes were made overnight and erased by morning. It was the classic boom-bust cycle before economists had clean models to explain it. Human greed and panic on a conveyor belt. Rockefeller was 20 years old then, working in Cleveland with a bookkeeper's eye for patterns. And what he saw in Pennsylvania wasn't romance, he saw instability. And most people, when they see instability, chase the peak. They want the strike, the lucky well, the dramatic payout. Rockefeller didn't. He looked past the drilling and saw the refining. Drilling was volatile, risky, dependent on geology and luck. Refining was different. Refining was where chaos became product. Crude oil was not yet power. It was potential. The real business was turning it into kerosene, light for lamps, fuel for a world still living before widespread electricity. Rockefeller understood something that modern finance still rewards. The safest wealth often sits not at the flashy front of the boom, but in the less glamorous middle, where you can standardize, optimize, and scale. So in 1863, he invested about $4,000 in his first refinery in Cleveland. Within 2 years, it was the largest refinery in the city. But Cleveland wasn't a quiet marketplace. It was crowded, around 30 refineries jostling, bleeding margins, constantly one bad shipment away from collapse. The industry wasn't built like a stable ladder. It was built like a knife fight. And this is where Rockefeller's true innovation begins. Most men in that environment try to compete on price. Rockefeller aimed at something colder. He wanted to eliminate competition itself, not by shouting, not by violence, by designing an economic machine so efficient and so strategically positioned that rivals couldn't survive inside the same ecosystem. And the first component of that machine had a name that sounds harmless, even academic: vertical integration. Vertical integration means you control every layer of the supply chain. Most refineries did one job: buy crude, refine it, and sell kerosene through distributors, one slice of the pie. Rockefeller wanted the whole pie. He began pulling the surrounding industries into his orbit. Barrels weren't just containers, they were a cost center, so he moved into barrel making. Transportation wasn't just shipping, it was leverage, so he invested in tank cars and negotiated deals with railroads. Warehousing wasn't storage, it was control of timing and supply, so he built capacity to hold product when others were forced to sell cheap. Distribution wasn't a final step, it was the customer relationship, so he tightened control over how kerosene reached the market. Every step that used to generate profit for someone else, he brought in-house. This did two things at once. It lowered his costs and increased his power. If competitors paid 25 cents per barrel, he could manufacture his own for $15. If railroads begged for fair rates, Rockefeller negotiated rebates, quiet discounts that made his shipping cheaper than theirs. And here is the key. Once your costs are structurally lower, you don't just win, you can choose who gets to exist, because you can sell at prices that others cannot match without bleeding to death. You can operate comfortably where they operate on panic. This wasn't merely efficiency, it was a weaponized advantage. And the market, when it meets a weaponized advantage, doesn't stay a market for long. It becomes a funnel, pushing wealth upward into the hands of whoever controls the narrowest points. By 1870, Rockefeller formalized what he was building: Standard Oil Company of Ohio. His refining capacity had grown from a small start into something approaching an industrial gravity well. But even then, he still controlled only 4% of American refining. And for Rockefeller, 4% wasn't progress, it was vulnerability. Because in a fragmented industry, power is always temporary. Someone can undercut you, someone can outgrow you, someone can innovate around you. If you want permanence, you don't compete inside fragmentation, you end fragmentation. So Rockefeller moved to phase 2, the part of the blueprint that modern corporations still quietly copy: horizontal integration. If vertical integration is controlling the supply chain from top to bottom, horizontal integration is controlling the field side to side, buying, absorbing, or destroying competitors until choice becomes an illusion. And in the early 1900s, Rockefeller was about to demonstrate exactly how that works, rapidly, ruthlessly, and with a precision that would echo across corporate history like a warning shot. Because in Cleveland, he wasn't preparing to win a market, he was preparing to erase it. In 1872, Cleveland's oil industry still believed it was a marketplace. Dozens of refinery owners woke up every morning thinking they were competing, cutting prices, negotiating rail rates, hoping efficiency would be enough. They didn't realize the market had already ended because Rockefeller wasn't competing anymore. He was consolidating. What followed became known not by accident, but by reputation, the Cleveland Massacre. And despite the violent name, there were no buns, no mobs, no blood in the streets. Just contracts, pricing pressure, and economic suffocation. Rockefeller approached the refinery owners one by one, quietly, professionally. He made the same offer each time. Sell your refinery to Standard Oil. If they accepted, Rockefeller paid a fair price, sometimes even generous. Often, he kept the owners on as managers, folded neatly into his growing machine. Their livelihood survived, their independence didn't. If they refused, the tone changed. Rockefeller didn't threaten, he didn't argue, he simply lowered prices. Standard Oil would sell kerosene below cost, something Rockefeller could afford because of his vertical integration and secret railroad rebates. His competitors, operating on thin margins, could not. Every gallon sold was a loss for them. They had two options: sell to Rockefeller or go bankrupt. Some resisted, believing the storm would pass. It didn't. Within 3 months, 25 of Cleveland's 26 refineries were under Rockefeller's control. In a single quarter, he jumped from controlling about 4% of American refining capacity to roughly 25%, not through innovation alone, through elimination. This was the moment the blueprint crystallized. Offer acquisition first. If refused, initiate economic warfare. Buy the remains. It sounds brutal because it was, but it was also devastatingly effective. And more importantly, it was repeatable. This wasn't a one-time event. It was a process that could be scaled, exported, and refined. The modern merger and acquisition playbook didn't emerge in boardrooms in the 20th century. It emerged right here in Cleveland, when Rockefeller proved that markets could be engineered instead of merely entered. And once he had mastered the local terrain, he turned outward. Throughout the 1870s, Standard Oil expanded aggressively across the country: New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Baltimore. The same pattern repeated itself everywhere. Railroad rebates ensured Rockefeller shipping costs were lower than anyone else's. Sometimes railroads literally paid Standard Oil to ship oil while charging competitors premium rates. Vertical integration squeezed costs down further, and when competitors still refused to sell, price wars followed. These weren't temporary discounts, they were sustained losses, strategic bleeding meant to break resistance. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled about 90% of America's oil refining capacity. 90%. At that point, the word competition loses meaning. This wasn't a dominant firm inside a market. This was the market. But Rockefeller understood something subtle and crucial. Monopolies create enemies. Political enemies, public enemies, legal enemies. And by the late 19th century, those enemies were gathering momentum. Journalists labeled him a robber baron. Cartoons depicted him as an octopus, its tentacles wrapped around railroads, Congress, and industry. More dangerously, lawmakers were beginning to respond. Rockefeller saw the risk early because monopolies face two existential threats. The first is legality. In 1890, the U.S. Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, explicitly designed to target monopolistic power like Standard Oil's. The second threat is legitimacy. The public hated Rockefeller, and hatred invites intervention. So Rockefeller needed something new, a structure that could maintain control while appearing compliant, a form that could diffuse responsibility while concentrating power. And in 1882, his lawyers delivered it: the trust. This is one of the most important moments in corporate history and one of the least understood. At the time, corporations were limited by state law. A company incorporated in Ohio couldn't legally own companies operating in other states. Rockefeller's empire had outgrown those borders. So instead of one company owning others, he created something different, a trust. Here's how it worked. The stock of all Standard Oil companies across different states was transferred into a single trust. That trust was controlled by a small group of trustees, Rockefeller and his closest associates. Technically, the individual companies still existed. In reality, they all answered to the same command center. This structure did something revolutionary. It separated ownership from operation. The trust didn't refine oil. It didn't ship barrels. It didn't sell kerosene. It simply owned. And ownership, when abstracted, is harder to regulate. The Standard Oil Trust became the first major corporate trust in American history, and immediately others copied it. Sugar Trust, Tobacco Trust, Steel Trust. The trust wasn't just a workaround, it was the prototype for the modern holding company, the parent entity that owns subsidiaries, shields liability, optimizes taxes, and centralizes control without appearing operationally dominant. If this structure sounds familiar, it should. Modern corporations didn't invent it, they inherited it. By the early 1900s, Standard Oil's dominance was almost total. By 1904, it controlled around 91% of oil refining and 85% of final sales. Rockefeller had become the richest man on earth. His fortune was estimated at around $900 million at the time, roughly $25 billion today by simple inflation measures. But those numbers understate the truth. At his peak, Rockefeller's wealth is estimated at $400 billion in today's dollars, more than Bezos, more than Musk, more than Gates, combined. And unlike many modern billionaires, Rockefeller didn't rely on stock appreciation alone. He relied on structure, legal architecture, market dominance, and systemic leverage. But as high as his wealth rose, the louder the backlash became. In 1906, journalist Ida Tarbell published The History of the Standard Oil Company, meticulously documenting Rockefeller's tactics, railroad rebates, predatory pricing, secret deals. Public outrage surged, and eventually the law caught up. In 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly. The company was ordered to be broken up into 34 separate firms. On paper, it looked like justice, the empire dismantled, the monopoly destroyed, the system defeated. But this is where most historical tellings stop too early, because what happened next reveals the true genius and danger of Rockefeller's design. When Standard Oil was broken up, Rockefeller didn't lose control. He owned shares in all 34 companies, and those companies, freed from the legal burden of being one giant monopoly, began competing, innovating, expanding. The result? Before the breakup, Standard Oil stock traded around $600 per share. After the breakup, the combined value of the new companies exceeded $2,000 per share. Rockefeller's wealth didn't shrink, it tripled. The breakup didn't destroy the system, it optimized it. Because splitting a monopoly into regionally dominant firms isn't dismantling power, it's redistributing it more efficiently. And over the next century, those pieces quietly merged back together. Standard Oil of New York became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Exxon and Mobil merged in 1999. Chevron absorbed others. BP acquired former Standard Oil descendants. The monopoly that was destroyed in 1911 reassembled itself, slowly, legally, invisibly. But Standard Oil wasn't Rockefeller's most important legacy. The real legacy was the method, because once the blueprint existed, it could be applied anywhere. And in the modern economy, it has been, in technology, in finance, in pharmaceuticals, in logistics. And next, we're going to trace exactly how that blueprint migrated, industry by industry, until it became the invisible architecture of daily life. Because once you recognize Rockefeller's system in the present, you start realizing you were never choosing between companies. You were choosing between branches of the same tree. By the time Standard Oil was officially dismantled in 1911, most Americans believed the danger had passed. The monster had been slain. The octopus had been cut apart. The monopoly era, at least this chapter of it, was over. That belief was comforting and completely wrong. Because what the Supreme Court destroyed was not the system. It destroyed the logo. What Rockefeller left behind was something far more durable than a corporation. He left behind a logic. And once a logic proves it can generate unprecedented wealth, it doesn't disappear, it migrates. The Standard Oil breakup is often taught as a victory for democracy over capital, but in practice, it became one of the most important demonstrations of how power survives regulation. Rockefeller himself barely needed to intervene. He already owned the structure. The newly independent companies, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, and others, were still staffed by executives trained inside Standard Oil culture. They shared supply chains, pricing instincts, and a common origin story. They didn't need to collude explicitly. They had been raised the same way. This is one of the most underestimated forces in economics, institutional memory. When systems train people, those people carry the system forward, even when the organization technically disappears. By the mid-20th century, the oil industry had reconsolidated into an oligopoly, not one giant monopoly, but a small circle of giants, coordinated, disciplined, and extraordinarily powerful. And this is where Rockefeller's legacy becomes less about oil and more about everywhere else. Because the early 20th century was not just an era of oil, it was the birth of modern corporate capitalism. Steel, railroads, banking, chemicals, manufacturing. Each industry faced the same question: do we compete or do we consolidate? Rockefeller had already answered, and the most successful companies copied him. But there was one final innovation Rockefeller introduced that would ensure his influence extended far beyond business. Something that softened his public image while deepening his control: philanthropy. In 1913, John D. Rockefeller created the Rockefeller Foundation, endowing it with an initial gift of $250 million, over $7 billion in today's dollars. On the surface, this looked like redemption, the most hated man in America giving back, funding medicine, education, public health. The narrative was irresistible, the robber baron transformed into the benevolent elder. But beneath the surface, the foundation accomplished several things simultaneously. First, it preserved wealth. Money placed into foundations was shielded from estate taxes. Rockefeller didn't just pass on wealth, he institutionalized it. Second, it purchased legitimacy. Philanthropy reframed Rockefeller's story. Newspapers that once attacked him now praised his generosity. Universities named buildings after him. His image softened. Third, and most importantly, it shaped knowledge itself. The Rockefeller Foundation became one of the most influential forces in modern medicine and education. It funded medical schools. It restructured curricula. It promoted a model of medicine focused on pharmaceuticals, laboratory science, and standardized treatment. This wasn't conspiracy, it was strategy. By deciding what gets funded, you decide what gets researched. By deciding what gets researched, you decide what becomes truth. The foundation funded institutions that trained doctors, researchers, and policymakers, embedding Rockefeller's influence into the intellectual bloodstream of society. And here's the part most people miss. Many pharmaceutical companies later profited enormously from a medical system shaped by Rockefeller-backed institutions. This wasn't accidental, it was alignment. By the time Rockefeller died in 1937, at the age of 97, he had lived long enough to witness something extraordinary. His company had been dismantled, his wealth had multiplied, his methods had spread across industries, and his foundations were shaping how future generations would think. But Rockefeller's true triumph wasn't personal, it was structural. Other tycoons faded after death. Carnegie built steel, but U.S. Steel eventually fragmented. Vanderbilt built railroads, but they declined and decentralized. J.P. Morgan dominated finance, but his personal grip weakened after his passing. Rockefeller was different, because Rockefeller didn't just build companies, he built a system. And systems don't die when individuals do. They self-replicate. By the late 20th century, the Standard Oil blueprint had quietly become the default operating model of corporate success. And then came the digital age, which didn't replace the system, it perfected it. Consider how modern corporations behave. Amazon didn't just sell books. It built warehouses, logistics networks, delivery fleets, payment systems, cloud infrastructure. It vertically integrated every layer, exactly like Rockefeller. And then it expanded horizontally, buying competitors, absorbing adjacent markets, copying successful products, and using its scale to undercut anyone who resisted. When regulators questioned Amazon's dominance, the company responded not with defiance, but complexity. Subsidiaries, divisions, internal accounting structures. Sound familiar? Google followed the trust model too. When antitrust scrutiny increased, Google reorganized into Alphabet, a holding company controlling search, video, AI, health, autonomous vehicles, and more. Each unit technically separate, all strategically aligned. This is the Standard Oil Trust reborn, digital, global, and infinitely scalable. The pharmaceutical industry mirrors Rockefeller's regulatory capture playbook. Companies fund regulators through user fees. They lobby for patent extensions. They influence clinical standards. Control the rules, and you don't need to crush competitors. The rules do it for you. The financial sector adopted the holding company structure wholesale. After the 2008 financial crisis, regulators struggled with a basic question. Who do you regulate? The parent company? The subsidiaries? The instruments held off balance sheet? Rockefeller solved that problem in 1882. Banks copied it a century later. And then there's philanthropy, now the final act of every modern billionaire. Foundations, initiatives, charitable trusts. They shape global health, education policy, climate research. And they do so while minimizing taxes, preserving control, and cementing legacy. This is not coincidence, it's inheritance. The Rockefeller family itself never disappeared. His grandson, David Rockefeller, became one of the most powerful financial figures of the 20th century, chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, co-founder of elite global policy forums, a quiet architect of international finance. The family's wealth today, estimated around $11 billion, is dispersed across trusts and foundations, invisible, durable, still shaping policy. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable realization. The system Rockefeller built was never meant to be escaped. It was meant to be inhabited. You don't opt out of gasoline markets. You don't opt out of digital infrastructure. You don't opt out of banking. You don't opt out of modern medicine. You move through channels that were designed long before you were born, channels optimized for efficiency and extraction. And this is where the story becomes less about history and more about you. Because once you understand that the modern economy didn't emerge organically, once you see that it was designed, the question changes. It's no longer, is this fair? It becomes, what do I do inside a system I cannot escape? And that question, how to respond, resist, or reposition, is where Rockefeller's legacy becomes not just historical, but personal. By the time you're born into a system, it no longer looks like a system. It looks like reality. That's Rockefeller's final achievement. Not domination, but normalization. Because the most powerful systems don't announce themselves. They dissolve into the background until resistance feels irrational and alternatives feel unrealistic. To understand how Rockefeller's method still governs daily life, you have to stop thinking in terms of companies and start thinking in terms of mechanisms. The system doesn't extract wealth through force. It extracts through dependency. Let's break down the mechanism, not abstractly, but concretely. You wake up in the morning. You need transportation. Gasoline is your first dependency. You technically have choices: Exxon, Chevron, BP, Shell. But those aren't choices in any meaningful sense. They are price-coordinated oligopolies, companies descended from Standard Oil or structured using its methods. Their supply chains, refining capacity, and distribution networks are so consolidated that competition occurs only at the margins. You're not choosing who to pay. You're choosing which branch of the same tree gets your money. This is horizontal consolidation at work, not monopoly in name, but monopoly in outcome. Next, you buy goods. Maybe you don't like Amazon. Maybe you try to avoid it. But Amazon's logistics network sets the price floor for retail. Even when you buy from Walmart or Target, those companies must match Amazon's scale, speed, and pricing, or die. This is vertical integration in the modern era. Vast warehouses, delivery fleets, payment systems, cloud infrastructure. Amazon doesn't just sell products, it owns the road those products travel on. And then there's something Rockefeller never had, but would have mastered instantly: data. Modern monopolies don't just observe markets, they instrument them. Third-party sellers feed Amazon real-time data about what sells, when, and why. Amazon analyzes that data, produces competing products, and privileges them in search results. This is the 21st century version of Rockefeller's price war. Legal, invisible, devastating. You don't need to destroy competitors outright when you can drain them slowly. Then you search for information. Google controls roughly 90% of global search. That's a higher share than Standard Oil ever achieved. Yet Google isn't treated like a monopoly because its product is free. You don't pay with money, you pay with attention, behavior, and data. Rockefeller charged pennies per gallon. Google charges fragments of your identity. From a systems perspective, it's an upgrade. A monopoly so complete that users don't feel exploited because the cost isn't denominated in cash. You use social media: Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. Different apps, same owner. Horizontal consolidation disguised as diversity. You feel like you're choosing platforms. You're not. You're choosing interfaces. Then there's healthcare. You see a doctor trained in a standardized medical system shaped by early 20th century foundations. You receive pharmaceuticals developed under regulatory frameworks influenced by industry lobbying. You pay insurance companies structured as holding firms designed to diffuse accountability. Each step feels separate. Together, they form a closed loop. And this is the core of Rockefeller's system: vertical dependency combined with horizontal concentration. At every stage, your options narrow, not because you're forced, but because alternatives are systematically starved. This is how extraction works without violence. Now let's talk numbers, not to shock you, but to ground the abstraction. The average American spends roughly $4,000 per year on gasoline, $3,000 per year on Amazon and Amazon-influenced retail. $5,000 per year on healthcare costs beyond insurance, $4,000 plus per year on internet, data, and digital services. That's over $13,000 per year flowing to systems built on Rockefeller's blueprint. Over a working lifetime, that approaches $650,000 in wealth transfer, not to thousands of small competitors, but to a small circle of dominant firms, extractors rather than innovators. And here's the crucial point. You didn't choose this architecture. You were born into it. And because it's efficient, it feels inevitable. This is the psychological genius of the system. It delivers real benefits. Before Standard Oil, kerosene cost around 58 cents per gallon. After Rockefeller's efficiencies, it dropped to around 8 cents, a reduction of nearly 86%. That mattered. Homes were lit, lives improved, productivity increased. The system works. Amazon delivers products in 2 days. Google answers questions in seconds. Pharmaceutical companies develop life-saving drugs. This is why resistance is complicated, because the system isn't evil, it's effective. But effectiveness has a cost. Efficiency concentrates power, and concentrated power doesn't redistribute itself. This is where Rockefeller's worldview becomes important. He famously said, "Competition is a sin." Most people hear arrogance, but Rockefeller meant something deeper and more unsettling. Competition duplicates effort, it wastes capital, it produces instability. In his mind, consolidation was moral. It organized chaos. And in a narrow technical sense, he wasn't wrong. The system produces cheap goods, rapid innovation, and stable supply. What it doesn't produce is broad ownership. That's the trade-off. You get convenience, someone else gets control. So what are your options? Rockefeller's system leaves you with 3. The first is acceptance. You accept that advanced capitalism trends toward consolidation. You use the systems. You enjoy the efficiencies. You don't fight gravity. This is what most people do, consciously or not. The second is resistance. You support antitrust enforcement. You buy from small businesses. You accept higher costs and lower convenience in exchange for decentralization. This path is morally compelling. It's also exhausting, because you're pushing against structures embedded in law, infrastructure, and culture. The third option is the one Rockefeller himself would recognize: understanding and positioning. If you cannot escape the system, you stop pretending you're outside it. You study it. You anticipate where value concentrates. You align yourself with the extractors rather than remaining only the extracted from. This isn't ideology, it's pattern recognition. Rockefeller didn't just sell kerosene. He owned the system that sold kerosene. And that distinction between user and owner is where most people misunderstand power. The modern economy still rewards ownership of systems more than participation in them. And that brings us to the final truth of Rockefeller's legacy. He didn't just become the richest man in history. He made sure that wealth accumulation itself followed a repeatable formula, one that could operate without him, one that could survive regulation, public outrage, and even its own dismantling. Which leads to the final question. Not, was Rockefeller good or bad, but something far more relevant. What happens when a system designed for efficiency reaches its logical conclusion? When every industry collapses into 3 to 5 dominant players? When barriers to entry rise every year? When consolidation becomes not an event, but a permanent condition? That's where we are now. And in the final part, we'll confront the end state of the Rockefeller system. Not just how it works, but what it means for the future, and whether seeing it changes anything at all. By the time a system reaches maturity, it stops expanding outward. It starts tightening inward. That's where the Rockefeller system is now. Not growing in size, but in density. Every decade, fewer companies control more of the economy. Every cycle of crisis accelerates the process. Recessions don't destroy dominant firms. They eliminate the weak and hand market share to the strong. This is not a flaw. It is the system functioning exactly as designed. Rockefeller understood something most people still resist accepting. Markets don't naturally stay competitive. Left alone, efficiency favors scale. Scale favors consolidation. Consolidation favors permanence. And permanence favors those already inside. Look across today's economy and the pattern is unmistakable. Search, one dominant platform. Social media, a handful of owners. Cloud infrastructure, 3 giants. Banking, a small circle of systemically important institutions. Oil, an oligopoly with shared DNA. Pharmaceuticals, a few firms controlling patents, pipelines, and regulation. This is not accidental convergence. It is the logical end state of a system that rewards control over participation. And at this stage, something subtle happens. The system stops pretending to offer exit. Choice becomes ceremonial. You can choose which platform, but not whether to be on one. You can choose which bank, but not whether to use banking. You can choose which employer, but not whether to sell labor into consolidated markets. Rockefeller's system doesn't trap you with chains, it traps you with dependency. And the deeper dependency goes, the less visible power becomes. This is why modern monopolies don't look like villains. They look like utilities, essential, reliable, too important to disrupt. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable realization of all. The system doesn't need to be defended. It defends itself. When regulators threaten breakup, complexity intervenes. When public outrage rises, philanthropy responds. When alternatives appear, they are acquired or suffocated. The system has antibodies. This is why the Rockefeller method survived antitrust law, survived public condemnation, survived even the formal destruction of its flagship company. Because Rockefeller didn't just build power, he built resilience. And resilience is what separates temporary dominance from structural dominance. Now, this is usually the point where people ask, so what's the solution? And the honest answer is unsatisfying. There is no clean exit, no reset button, no return to a world of thousands of small competitors without sacrificing the efficiencies modern life depends on. Rockefeller's system solved real problems. It lowered prices, stabilized supply, standardized production. But it did so by centralizing ownership. And centralization, once entrenched, does not voluntarily unwind. This is the paradox of advanced capitalism. The same mechanisms that make life convenient also make power unreachable. Which means the real choice isn't between system and no system, it's between ignorance and awareness. Most people move through the economy believing they are making individual decisions, shopping, searching, subscribing, voting with dollars. They're not wrong, but they're incomplete, because those decisions are being made inside channels that were carved long before they arrived, channels that quietly direct value upward. Rockefeller understood this better than anyone. He didn't want customers, he wanted dependence. He didn't want competitors, he wanted coordination. And he didn't want admiration, he wanted inevitability. That's why a century and a half later, his influence is still measurable, not in headlines, but in structure. John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, but the system he built became stronger after his death. Because once a system no longer depends on a person, it becomes immortal. That is his true legacy, not Standard Oil, not the fortune, but the architecture of modern economic power. Vertical integration, horizontal consolidation, holding companies, regulatory capture, philanthropy as influence. These are not historical artifacts. They are the scaffolding of the present. And here is the final, quiet truth. Rockefeller didn't believe competition was evil because it hurt people. He believed it was evil because it wasted energy. From his perspective, the system was moral precisely because it was efficient. And that belief won. The world we live in today, fast, cheap, interconnected, concentrated, is proof. So when you hear people argue that monopolies are a distortion of capitalism, understand this: they are its conclusion. And when you hear calls to break up big companies, remember what history already showed us. Breaking up the company does not break the system. Only understanding does. Because once you see the pattern, you stop being surprised by outcomes. You stop asking why wealth concentrates. You stop wondering why regulation fails. You stop expecting competition to save you. And you start seeing the economy for what it is. Not a battlefield of equals, but a machine. A machine built long ago. A machine that still runs. A machine you live inside every single day. John D. Rockefeller didn't just create a company you can't escape. He created a system you can't escape. The only freedom left is awareness. And awareness, while it doesn't dismantle the machine, it does change how you move within it. That was Rockefeller's world. This is ours. By the end of his life, John D. Rockefeller had achieved something no emperor, king, or general ever managed. He made power impersonal. Empires before him rose and fell with bloodlines. When the ruler died, the structure weakened. When the dynasty fractured, the system collapsed. Rockefeller changed that. He built power into process, into contracts, into corporate law, into tax codes, into supply chains so long and complex that no single human could ever fully see them. That's why his system didn't die in 1911. That's why it didn't die in 1937. That's why it didn't die in 2008. Because systems don't die when they're efficient. They get rescued. Think about every major crisis of the last century. The Great Depression didn't end corporate consolidation, it accelerated it. World War II didn't decentralize industry, it fused corporations with the state. The 2008 financial crisis didn't dismantle big banks, it made them too big to fail. The pandemic didn't weaken tech monopolies, it handed them historic dominance. Each crisis removed weaker competitors. Each rescue strengthened incumbents. This is Rockefeller's logic, repeating. Not because anyone consciously worships him, but because the architecture he designed rewards the same outcomes again and again. And this brings us to the final unsettling symmetry. Rockefeller built Standard Oil by positioning himself upstream of chaos. Today, the most powerful corporations position themselves upstream of life itself. Information, health, energy, communication, money. They don't need to dictate behavior, they just need to be unavoidable. And when something becomes unavoidable, resistance turns theoretical. You can protest oil companies, but you still need fuel. You can criticize big tech, but you still need connectivity. You can distrust banks, but you still need money to function. This is not oppression in the traditional sense, it's structural dependence, and it's far more stable. Which is why the most important lesson of Rockefeller's story isn't about morality, it's about visibility. Most people believe systems exist around them. Rockefeller understood systems exist through people, through habits, through defaults, through convenience. That's why the system doesn't feel hostile, it feels normal. And normal is the most powerful disguise. When Rockefeller said competition is a sin, he wasn't speaking like a villain. He was speaking like an engineer. Competition is wasteful. Duplication is inefficient. Consolidation is order. From that worldview, monopolies aren't crimes, they're conclusions. And history sided with him. Every sector that matures follows the same arc: explosion, competition, consolidation, oligopoly, permanence. Oil did it first, everything else followed. So what does awareness actually change? It doesn't collapse Amazon. It doesn't break Google. It doesn't dissolve banks or pharmaceutical giants. But it does something quieter and more personal. It changes expectations. You stop believing the system will save you. You stop believing competition will magically return. You stop waiting for regulation to undo structures that regulation itself protects. And once you stop waiting, you start thinking differently. About ownership, about leverage, about where value actually flows. Rockefeller didn't become powerful by consuming. He became powerful by positioning. That distinction still matters. You may not escape the Rockefeller system, but you can stop being confused by it. You can stop blaming yourself for outcomes that are structural. You can stop mistaking convenience for freedom. You can stop thinking the economy is broken when it's functioning exactly as designed. And that clarity, while uncomfortable, is the real inheritance Rockefeller left behind. Not oil, not money, not even monopoly, but a map. A map of how power actually moves. Once you see the map, you don't unsee it. And that's why this story still matters in 2025. Because understanding the system isn't academic, it's survival. John D. Rockefeller didn't just shape the modern economy, he wrote its operating manual. And every day you live inside it, whether you know his name or not.